The Albanese government has succeeded with the help of the Greens to push through some radical environmental policies from 43% emission cuts to price caps and a plan to rid households of gas appliances. Joining me now to discuss the impact of these interventions is President of the Centre of Industrial Progress, Alex Epstein. Alex, we've got industry experts warning that the plan to transition households away from gas appliances to electric is going to be costly, short-sighted, and would need billions in government money to make the switch cost-effective for consumers. But this is what Greens leader Adam Bandt had to say.
Gas is as dirty as coal. Gas is polluting, it's unhealthy, and it's expensive. Today is the day that Parliament understands that gas is not something we're transitioning to, it's something Australia needs to get away from.
So, Alex, coal is dirty, gas is just as bad according to the Greens, and nuclear is not an option in this country. Where does that leave Australia?
I mean, Australia is really doing its best to emulate all the mistakes of Europe and to some extent the US. I mean, if you look at everything they're doing, they're restricting your options. I mean, if this electrification is such a great idea, why don't people do it voluntarily? The reason people are choosing to use gas is that gas is really cost effective for a lot of purposes. It's good for home heating, it's good for cooking, it's good for industry. And so electricity should have to outcompete gas if it's actually as good. Now, unfortunately, what you're seeing is you're trying to electrify things while you're also restricting the supply of reliable electricity. This is what we're doing in the US, where we're threatening to shut off 1/5 of our reliable electricity in the next 7 years. And then you have places like California, which say no more, use electricity for everything, but then don't charge your EV because we don't have enough electricity.
Absolutely. And just on a practical level, this week I had a short power outage, but I was still able to have a shower because I've got gas water heating. I was able to boil some eggs and have a meal. But if everything is dependent on electricity and the electricity goes out, what are households supposed to do? Start a fire?
That's a really good question. And there's definitely an appeal to people who really want centralized control of everything. They like the idea of electricity. The more you centralize things with electricity, the more you have to be obsessed with having abundant, reliable electricity. But you see the opposite. You see centralization, but then restricting coal, restricting gas, not in the case of Australia, not having nuclear at all, and then saying, let's somehow rely on these unreliables. And then what's happening now is because of all the restrictions, gas is getting expensive, and the Greens are taking a victory lap. Like, oh, gas is expensive. No, you made it expensive. This is why I call this the Tanya Harding case against fossil fuels, because you cripple them, then you make them expensive, and then you say, see, they can't compete.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are told by not just the Greens in this country, but also by Minister Chris Bowen and the rest of the Albanese government that not only are renewables the future, but it's supposed to be the cheapest form of energy. Is that accurate, Alex? Is there any evidence of that around the world with countries that have embraced new renewables and seen prices go down without nuclear energy?
No, I mean, one thing is just people need to recognize, so these unreliables, what they provide is they provide part of your electricity. And electricity is just a fraction of what we use energy for. We use energy for residential heat, for industrial heat, for transportation, particularly heavy duty transportation. A lot of this stuff electricity can't do. And then within electricity, solar and wind are totally dependent on reliable sources of electricity because they can go to near zero at any given time. When you see claims that they are cheaper, this is just partial cost accounting. They're only looking at the cost of, say, the solar panels and the wind turbines, but not of the whole backup infrastructure. When you incorporate the cost of everything, solar and wind consistently make things more expensive. And in any case, they don't replace fossil fuels. They depend on fossil fuels.
And there are reports now that Green Norway, it's costing twice as much to charge an electric vehicle in Oslo than to fill up a gas-powered vehicle. That's not optimal, is it, Alex?
Yeah, I haven't run those numbers, myself. But what you're really seeing with the EVs is there are all these very optimistic claims. But then, as I said, we're restricting the supply of reliable electricity. That also increases the cost of electricity. And I think the biggest threat of all is you have these underpowered grids that are going to have radical increases in electricity demand at a time when their supply is lower than it's been. Where I live in California, Newsom announced no internal combustion engines. Then 5 days later, he said, don't charge your electric vehicles. That's with 3% market penetration. So 3% market penetration, we can't charge our EVs consistently. What's that going to look like at 50%? The people advocating this don't know and don't care.
Well, it is so short-sighted. You're so right, because the pressure being put on the grid with 3% is more than it can bear. And forget about 50%. What's going to happen at 10%, 15%? And the way they're going, particularly in California, where they've said no new gas-powered vehicles by, was it 2030 or 2032?
2035.
They have 2035. They have no way to actually implement this, have they? They are relying on technologies that don't even exist and fuel sources that don't even exist for any of this to actually happen in any meaningful way.
I mean, one point I make a lot in my book, Fossil Future, is you can't think of the green energy movement as this movement that's really enthusiastic about these technologies. It's really a movement that's hostile toward every form of energy. Notice they're hostile toward fossil fuels, hostile toward nuclear, hostile toward hydro. They're also hostile toward mining, which is necessary in huge quantities for solar and wind. So it's really an anti-industry, anti-human impact movement, but they pretend that green energy is practical. They pretend that they actually support it even because they want to get away with opposing the forms of energy that work. So it's no surprise they haven't thought through replacing fossil fuels. Of course, these are not geniuses who can do better than the market. They're anti-fossil fuel, anti-nuclear, anti-hydro, anti-industry people who just want to make an excuse for their anti-industrial goals.
Now, Jordan Peterson and Bjorn Lomborg have written a really important piece about how the world's biggest problems, the ones bringing the most human suffering, like hunger, for example, are being largely ignored while world leaders focus on emission cuts and environmental policy. They point out that more than 800 million people still struggle without enough food, and 3 million mothers and their children will die from hunger this year. And Alex, can you imagine the lives that could be saved if a fraction of what has been spent on climate change policies was spent on alleviating hunger, for example?
Well, that's true, but it's even worse because these climate change policies are antithetical to alleviating hunger. If you look at what's happened with the growth of fossil fuels, say from 1980, when I happened to be born, to 2020, we brought the number of people, the fraction of people living on $2 or less a day from 40% of the population to 10% of the population. The keys to that were freedom and fossil fuels. So when you're restricting fossil fuels, you're making energy more expensive. That makes everything more expensive, including food, clothing, shelter, medical care. So I agree with Bjorn and Jordan Peterson that, the priorities are totally out of whack, but it's even worse than that because this climate priority is an anti-fossil fuel, anti-energy priority. And that makes everything worse, including, by the way, climate, because you can't protect yourself from climate when you have unaffordable energy.
And finally, I have to ask you about President Biden's announcement that billions of dollars of US money is going to go to South Africa to stop them using coal.
Mobilizing $8 billion in public and private finance to help South Africa replace coal-fired power plants with renewable energy sources and develop cutting-edge energy solutions like clean hydrogen.
What's going to be the impact of that? Because South Africa's already had enormous issues with reliable energy sources.
It's so sad. I mean, I was in South Africa in 2017, and I was, pretty impressed by their grid, and they're using coal, and at least where I was seeing clean air. And you just think like this is a place that needs more energy, more productivity, more prosperity. And instead, we're doing this new thing where we in the US are paying billions of dollars to get other people to take a vow of poverty. But we're doing it to some of the poorest places in the world. It's so perverse. Look, there's no way, if you want to lower emissions, there's no way to do it humanely except by discovering cost competitive alternatives and innovating in them, like nuclear. It doesn't do any good to make poor countries get even poorer. Like, what is that going to accomplish? Is that going to stop China from building new coal plants? Is it going to stop India from building new coal plants? It's just this senseless destruction because people aren't thinking through what's actually good for human life.
Well said, Alex. And I know plenty of South Africans are struggling with regular blackouts, and this is, I think, going to make things even worse for them. You've again given us plenty to think about. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Thanks, Rita.